Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just 1 minute. I'm just going to finish setting up my desktop.
Okay, how's that? Is that better? Hopefully that sounds a little bit perfect. Love it. Thanks, Monique. I appreciate the feedback. Good morning from upstate New York. Good afternoon, good evening, good really late evening for those of you in other places. It's great to connect with you all. My name is Micah Shippee, and I'm really excited to talk to you about the future of work and planning for that change with our students in today's presentation. So what I intend to do with this presentation is a little bit different than my other ones. I often do presentations with augmented reality and virtual reality, and they're very interactive in that I have multiple screens open. For this one, I have a conversation I'm going to have with you, and I'll pause periodically and take a look at the chat as opposed to watching the chat live the whole time. I hope that's okay with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. If you have questions or thoughts, just drop them right in the chat. And then again, I will stop periodically to address whatever pops up. All right. So here we go. The WanderlustEDU, the future of work and preparing students for their future. It's a little bit different than our past, isn't it? This is based on some of the work that I've done in my book, WanderlustEDU. It's an educator's guide to innovation, change, and adventure. So that book is a culmination of multiple things, including my doctoral studies in instructional design. I studied how organizations adopt change, how they choose to change at the organizational level. So I'll think of a whole school or district choosing to shift. But I also focused on individuals and how individuals make that choice to change. And so all that's really informed my approach to instructional technology and thinking about my students. Now, I just finished my 20th year of teaching. I teach grade 8 social studies, again, in upstate New York, Syracuse. I left my students on March 16th for our quarantine. And in New York, we go till the end of June. So we were 3 months on quarantine and instruction. It was a real challenge. I had left them speaking about World War II, where, with World War II, we were at that point talking about how countries like the United States inside of the country banded together to, factories started making different products to support a war effort. And, we drew parallels to companies like Ford, for example, that started working with masks and respirators to support the COVID pandemic, the response. So that was fascinating. And then into June, our course of study brought us to the civil rights movement, which of course, for current events in the United States, are incredibly important. So I really wished, and I told my students, I wish we were together to make meaning of all of this. But because of the pandemic, it was a bit of a shift. And that shift is important because it also relates to what a lot of people believe the future of work is going to look like. This idea where we may not be physically together all the time, but we still have plenty of opportunity to grow in our work. Here's a couple of things about me. I'm a bit of a geo nerd, so I love Google Earth stuff and using the tools there. I also run a production team. These are my students and I from our Warriors Live program, where we do live morning announcements. Live morning announcements with 8th graders. What could go wrong, right? A lot of funny moments there. I also have the privilege of serving as the CEO for a company called Ready Learner One. We're an emergent technology solutions company, and we work in both the corporate and education spaces to bridge the gap between learner and content. And often we bridge that gap with emergent technology. So some iterations on classical interventions, as well as some dabblings in the new latest and greatest, like augmented and virtual realities. Before I transition here, I'm just going to double check the chat, make sure everybody's okay. Everybody looks good. All right, we're in the chat. We've even got Georgina Dean there. How do you like that? All right, very good. It looks like we're in a good spot. Again, I'm going to be popping in and out of the chat window, sliding back and forth, and I hope that works okay for you. All right, great. So one way I like to think about this, and I've seen this paraphrased in multiple places, is, you know, the education is changing because the world is changing. You know, we are responsive. We're responsive because we're trying to prepare for a better future. And so those changes are unbelievable. I've talked about this type of topic for many years. You know, wrote this book 18 months ago, and yet, man, the world has changed so much just within the last 4 or 5 months. There's several ways to look at change, and I really like looking at the Gartner hype cycle for emergent technologies, because it kind of gives me an idea for my students and what technologies are down the road that might have an impact on them. This is different than workflow shifts, which we'll get to in a minute, a little bit. But this curve shows you a 10-year line, a graph about what people are thinking about possible spaces for new technology to grow. So you see, you've got over here with newer things like the augmented reality cloud. So think of using augmented reality over the internet with a web-based AR, as opposed to downloading an app. Light delivery cargo drones. There's one we've been hearing a little bit about, with Amazon delivering packages through drones. A lot of talk about AI and what will the role of artificial intelligence be. And these innovation triggers mean these are things that we're excited about. But as you go over the hump, you know, you see 5G is here. You start to see less triggers. These are the ones that last. So these are the ones that will be around for a while, like autonomous driving and 3D sensing cameras. You know, these things are continuing. You know, Apple announced, as well as other companies, that they'll be using 3D sensing cameras, like with LiDAR technology. So a little bit geeky, but it's made for the corporate world. But I think as educators, it kind of reinforces when we dabble in 3D printing. It looks like 3D printing is a thing, right? So we're dabbling in those in our classroom. We're actually preparing students for their future. There's also another shift that's occurring. Big companies are not requiring a college education on an application. So that's kind of wild, right? So to apply for a really big company like these, you do not necessarily have to have a college degree. I believe Elon Musk announced for SpaceX the same thing. A college degree is not required to apply. So it's telling us something about the corporate and the education spaces and how they kind of conflict a little bit. You know, for the K-12 space, we've often looked at universities as what we're preparing our students for. And then universities are looking at the corporate space saying this is what we're preparing them for. But this is showing us that there's a little bit of a hiccup in our system, and that some people are looking to even just circumvent it and focus on skills related directly to these companies. Here's a couple of people that epitomize that. You've got Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. He didn't finish college. You've got Palmer Luckey in the middle. He started a company called Oculus. They're a VR company. He didn't finish college and he was homeschooled. You look over here at Dante Buckley. Dante Buckley's an interesting one who created a video game called Onward. And the Onward video game is a result of him taking a year off, a gap year between high school and college, and teaching himself Unity. Here's Dante's game. You can see it being played down here. Very much like an esports arena. This was at Oculus 5 in 2018. Oculus held this VR virtual reality esports competition, and it was my first time seeing this type of gameplay live. You know, these guys will often do it on their own at home over the internet, and yet here are these teams live together competing in a video game. And this happens to be Onward, which Dante Buckley wrote. You know, he talked about dropping out of college to focus on a year of game development, and he said he had some funds that didn't go towards tuition, so he went heads down and focused on a programming background, not necessarily gaming, watched YouTube, used resources, and just built Onward. He says that Onward is, you know, keep moving forward, and it was the perfect name for that point in his life, and that's what he named this very successful multi-million-dollar video game after. You know, Dante's ability to take a year off of college to teach him, not everybody can do that, to teach himself. Of course, he had to sacrifice along the way. But the idea of teaching yourself, learning the project management skills to organize yourself, it's difficult. I mean, a lot of us are finding that for the first time, working from home without punching a clock, if you will, without a geography that determines our work, like my school building. I don't know about you, but man, I found my school day going quite longer than usual because I was home, and this was the same place that I was working in. So there's some interesting shifts that are occurring with what we're doing in this pandemic. One of the things that I love to geek out about is a field of study called human performance technology. And human performance technology is based on an understanding of what helps people be successful. So here's my daughter, Liberty. She was dressed as a quote unquote nerd by her older sister. So thinking about students, I thought, since this is a nerdy thing, human performance technology, I'd use this Livy picture here. One of my favorite human performance technologists basically designed a way of thinking about it that he calls the knowledge, skills, environment, and motivation. And if those three things are positively addressed in learning and positively addressed in really any task that we're doing, then that's going to equal success. It's part of, again, human performance. When we start to remove those pieces, that's where it gets difficult for us. And I think at every point as educators, we can relate to this. When we remove knowledge, you know, we start to feel anxious. There's anxiety. I think of my 2 years ago, I had an experience where my administrator voluntold me that I would be teaching a whole new grade level that I had never taught. So in terms of content, I had real anxiety. I felt like I didn't know the stuff as much as I should to really deliver it properly to my students. When we remove skills, which is something that many colleagues of all of ours have experienced when it goes to shifting to remote learning. I mean, learning how to use, for some people, learning management tools like Teams or Google Classroom or Schoology, using them for the first time and having never done that before, that's a skill gap. And with a skill gap comes frustration. And again, maybe this one resonates now more than ever, but your environment is a really big deal. And if your space where you work, or in many of our cases, work, live, eat, sleep, breathe, if that space is not conducive to our productivity, we really feel trapped. You know, imagine working in a place with no windows, you know, just physically feeling trapped. I think the pandemic has made the value of a positive environment really resonate. And finally, motivation. And motivation, we know, comes in two forms. Motivation is both intrinsic and extrinsic. The extrinsic motivations, things like our salaries, our insurance, our vacation times, those are important, but it's the intrinsic that really addresses our why, if you will, in education. Why are we doing this? And it's that drives us internally. And that's more sustainable, I believe, than extrinsic motivation. So this chart here I put together based on the work of human performance technologists. This is Joe Harless, and if you could find a little bit more about it in my book, WanderlustEDU. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about, well, I did say I would kind of stop and check the chat. Checking that, yes, Liberty is adorable, absolutely. Yes, Jordan loves that Oculus, that's for sure, or Georgina. Yes, I hope you can get it in Jordan. I agree totally. They'll get there. All right, let's go back in. All right, so connected knowledge is one of the things I want to speak with you about. You know, traditionally in education, at least in the United States, we've talked about reading, writing, and arithmetic as these core things that students needed to do and needed to understand, needed to have a good a body of knowledge in their brains and skill set around these to be productive in society. And, you know, those are things that were kind of collated, if you will, about 100 years ago. Now I think we're shifting to taking that information and synthesizing it in what I call reform, reframe, and redefine. So we're using it in a new way that demonstrates knowledge. So traditionally, if I wanted my students to demonstrate knowledge, I might have them complete a quiz, complete a test. I don't know about you, but I found that some of my traditional Google form or form type assessments, students were collaborating on during remote learning, meaning as soon as they got feedback, they shared it with their friends. Yeah. So that, of course, that's a problem. But now maybe it's time to start thinking about, for me, being more critical about my assessments. And is that an assessment really worth it? Is that more of just measuring these three? And maybe it's time to create project-based instruction where students are synthesizing that knowledge and then building off of it to make meaning for our instruction. You know, the Industrial Revolution in the United States, again, that's my lens. I recognize that's my lens that I speak from. We talked over 100 years ago about creating and equipping a productive workforce. And of course, that productive workforce was people who could line up. They knew when the bell rang, their shift was over. They were there from 9 to 5, and this was their work day, or 8 to 5, or whatever, even longer in some cases. But the Industrial Revolution, it gets a lot of flack for how it informed education. But one thing it did was it prepared a workforce. You know, now, again, as I said earlier, we're starting to think about preparing students for higher ed. But that I don't know that that's working entirely well. I think there's great value in higher ed. I have a PhD. I've spent more time in college than most people. I'd like to think there's some value in that. However, is it for everyone? Does every student need that? Does every student need that immediately to be productive and to contribute to a greater world? And I think that's the question we're asking ourselves. We often, these are silos in the United States where you would hold corn after you harvest it. I'm not a farmer or in the agricultural industry, so if that's near and dear to you and I just offended you by my lack of knowledge, I apologize. But we often talk in education about siloing, and siloing is where this is where history goes. This is where English goes in the United States. This is where math goes. This is where science goes, and we don't bring together our instructional practice as much as I believe we should. You know, we've trained students to leave a classroom door, at least in secondary education, of math instruction, and then enter a classroom for history or social studies instruction. And the links between the two, they're frankly not strong enough regularly. In some places, they're very strong. But I think as education shifts, because the world is shifting, that's one thing we really need to do. I mean, we get to the point where we've been doing things so long that when change happens, we're not quite ready. I think of, I saw a commercial once of somebody on an escalator in a mall. So an escalator is the moving staircase that brings you up. And they were on this escalator and the power went out. And so they were stuck on the escalator and they just started to shout, "Help, help, help, we're stuck. Can somebody help us?" Now, there's stairs, right? So they're on stairs that are moving. They stopped moving, but there's still stairs. So you could actually move yourself. The difference is the disruption was unexpected. and it caused a little bit of panic. It was a silly commercial, but the idea resonated with me that, you know, in education, we've been kind of moving on a moving staircase that moves by itself, and now it just plain stopped with the pandemic. Now we have to decide how we're going to move forward and move up and move on. We've talked for many years about knowledge, again, in different silos. And now linking that knowledge together is what we can do through experience. And experience is that reframing that students can do and redefining that students can do. And that's going to come through teaching of relevant skills. So we have knowledge. Now let's take a look at teaching of relevant skills. The skills and expectations of our students and their future are a bit different. I'm going to play a video clip for you. I'm a little unsure of the volume, but it's not really necessary. Let's just take a look at what this future of work might look like, and then we'll pull it apart. I recognize the volume may not be coming in, but the visuals are what's important. Popping in the chat here. Yeah, I apologize for the lack of sound. It's just an audio soundtrack. So what we're seeing with that video is this future of work. I'm taking a look at the chat now, seeing if there's something I can help you with. The video itself, that video is over a year old. I mean, imagine sharing that video in the future. I mean, oh my gosh, or updating that video for what can come next. Yeah, Beth, at the end, I'll dig that out for you and share it. Actually, what would be better, Beth, is I'll share it out through Twitter. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle, I'll put on here for you. I have a couple of video resources, so I'll make sure you get access to them. But there's my Twitter handle. I'll put it there. There's been more videos. I watch these videos and I'm like, oh, I should use this one. I should use this one. I should use this one. I like this one in particular because it conceptualizes some things that I think we can relate to directly in education. So I apologize for the blurriness. The top left here, that's an Amazon factory drone. So the Amazon, that drone is following a line on the floor, which reminds me very much of, what's the sad robot cartoon from Disney? Oh my gosh, what's his name? My kids love him. He likes Eva. What's his name? Oh, I gotta look at the chat and see if one of you guys remember it. It's the cartoon where he goes around and WALL-E. Yes, it's WALL-E. WALL-E's the name. It reminds me of WALL-E because, you know, in the cartoon WALL-E, he's following his compatriots are following lines on the ground. And so those lines that they're following around on the ground are kind of what Amazon's doing, and it's coding the robots to move packages. You have drones in the bottom here. The bottom left, you've got an agricultural drone that's droning a field. It's automating a manual task. On the bottom right, you've got surgery where people are using virtual reality headsets and these very precise tools to do surgery. And finally, in the top right, we saw a 3D printed house that took 24 hours to make. This is unbelievable. But now we have to think about where are the factory worker, where's the farmer, where is the nurse's assistant, where is the carpenter? So these are very valuable skills that exist, but where do these very valuable skills fit if this is really where we're going? And so that's what we really need to think about is this shift. I think for a long time, carpentry, for example, is going to exist for a long time as a special trade and a special skill of high value for prototyping. But if I was to cast a vision for 150 years from now, a carpenter might be a 3D model maker. It might be prototyping and designing for something that gets printed like this 3D home. I'm just guessing, but it's amazing to think about how things are changing, let alone education. What's going to happen to us? Can you automate curriculum? I don't know. It's kind of scary to me. If any Terminator fans out there, you might think about how Skynet took over the world. It's kind of scary stuff to think about all of that for sure. All right. So here's some direct educational examples. So instead of our Amazon robots going around the floor, we've got things like Spheros. And instead of our agriculture drone preparing the crops, we've got things like Scratch and blocky coding that allow us to create. We've got virtual reality headsets. I'll talk a little bit about that, like the Oculus Quest, my personal fave. And we've got 3D printed 3D printers that we have more access to. I actually have that one there. It's called a Flash Forge, and you know that was about 300 US, which is relatively inexpensive for a 3D printer. So my children here at home can start to think about 3D printing as a solution for problems. And they've done little birthday gifts for their friends and things like that through 3D printing. We printed masks for our local hospitals and food pantries with our 3D printer at home. And you know, thinking in a different way about tools and how tools can be used to solve societal problems, I think is very powerful. So when we look at videos like that, it reminds us of what we're doing right now with tools like these in our classrooms and in our schools. I really think the more we allow children to create, the more we teach them to think critically of the world around them. We want our students to be critical consumers. You know, when I was a kid, Saturday morning cartoons came on, riddled with cartoon commercials of toys that I needed to have. And I needed to have these toys. I didn't realize how cheap the toys were. What a cheesy little piece of plastic it was. But imagine if a child is printing on the 3D printer, man, they have a whole new perspective on what those toys are and how they're developed. And they can be more critical, I would think. Maybe that's romantic of me, I accept that. But I think it's the next step towards creating stronger, more mindful consumers. Now, soft skills are to me, a really important thing to discuss when we talk about what's next for our students, because soft skills are the thing that can't be replicated easily by a machine. You know, a hard skill, doing the math, doing programming, building with once we give it the information it needs. Those are hard skills that can in some ways be done by machines, but soft skills, making human perspective meaning of the world, that comes from us, and that's really important. Empathy is a soft skill that we should start to strive for with our students. It's a tough one. Jeff Weiner, who was the CEO of LinkedIn, LinkedIn's all about future of work and preparing workers. He talks about this hard skills, soft skills, when he says, as powerful as AI will ultimately become and is becoming, we're still miles away from computers being able to replicate and replace human interaction and human touch. There's a wonderful incentive for people to develop these skills because those jobs are going to be more stable for a long period of time. Understanding human interaction and how human interaction, I would say, is disrupted by remote learning and remote work. Our ability to get over that hurdle of being fully remote is very, very important. And that's going to be, I think, for us, something that we're going to have to really take a close look at our practice over the next year or so of schooling, as we still have the threat of a pandemic upon us. So I want you to think for a minute about what makes a good employee. Let me drop this in the chat. I'll pull this up. If you wouldn't mind hopping into, let me pull this up. Come on, there it is. I'll copy that. Here in the chat, would you mind dropping your thoughts on this? Dropping your thoughts on that. So what makes a good employee? I'm going to take a look at the chat window while you're pulling that up. Yeah, Georgina, I agree. AI is important. Voice recognition is based on the automation of a catalog of voice speech, and it's becoming incredibly more powerful and making it easier to approach writing and then reading, of course. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you, Patty. I love the 3D printer. I agree. I think it's a cool tool, right? Sherry, I'm reading through here. Yeah, this is the way we've always done it, right? And the most difficult things for us grown-ups, I know, it's the escalator. We're stuck on the moving staircase. The power goes out. What do we do now, right? Absolutely. All right, so Georgina added a few qualities. Cheryl has says a good employee is dedicated. Yep, very good. Added some too. Thank you, everybody. Let's take a look at this answer garden window. So I'll pull up my edge here and we'll drop it in. So Answer Garden is a cool platform. I'll be fair here. I have loaded this with some other folks, not my words, but some other colleagues that I've been working with. Here's what they talk about makes a good employee. So this is a pretty classic word cloud that grows in size as it's more frequent. So growth mindset had a few more people, empathetic had a few more people than charismatic, for example. So these are very important. Forward thinking, reliable, communication skills, self-starter. I tell you right now, that's one thing that really popped for me in this quarantine with my students is how they figure things out that if they were in the classroom, they would raise their hand and say, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me? And I would help them. Yet, when they're on their own, many of my students, not all of them, they figure things out. So that self-starter is a skill that I think we need to teach. These are great. Thank you, everybody, for contributing to them. Sweet. All right, I'm going to slide back over to my deck here. Let's take a look at a few more things. I do have more things for you to do, so stay with me on that. I like this from Heather McGowan, who looks at the future of learning. She talks about, the shift in the evolution of work. So if you think of a medieval farmer, if he needed something, he would do it all himself as an island unto himself. If you think of an apprentice model, learn a barterable skill. You might learn to become a potter to make pottery from a master potter. So it's apprentice, journeyman, master, right? Then if you look even more, we're looking at hyper-focused skill that's marketable. So how to program Android apps would be a hyper-focused skill, right? Maybe even more focused, how to program Android game apps. That would be a hyper-focused skill. And now shifting ahead, where are we going? Learning to adapt. And this is the part that I believe is hugely important for educators, for all of us to start to understand. It's that with technology and the world changing so rapidly, we've always relied on being the master of a skill or a master of a content. I would argue that our new mastery has to be change. We have to master the ability to pivot and change because the world is changing so rapidly. So rather than being an expert on using PowerPoint transitions and formatting a PowerPoint slide, it would be more important for me to master media design and what are the attributes that make a good message in a presentation, because I want to roll with whatever the next tool is that can better deliver that rather than rely on the laurels of my past successes, if you will. I've had a little bit of experience in life as a ski instructor. I actually taught downhill skiing for 16 years. I ran a children's ski school where I had children ages 3 to 12 learning to ski. I think there were a couple 2-year-olds snuck into the program. And my employees, as the manager of this, my employees were actually high school students and college students. So I got to, as a history teacher, work with students as employees and really got to see something a little different. I got to see how students worked and what their work ethic was, what their get up and go was on their own. And one thing that really became clear to me as in this case, an employer, was I started to see that children or students, I should say, young adults that had played a team sport or had been part of a club that relied on others, like in a team, they were more equipped to be self-starter employees than those that hadn't had those experiences. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people couldn't have those experiences, and that's something that we'll talk about. How do we open up access to a team-based experience? But it's significant. Those that, again, were contributors to a team, basketball, football, baseball, volleyball, they knew how to help each other. They, in turn, became better self-starters and just plain did a better job as employees. It really was a real eye-opener for me. Now, translating that to my classroom, I started to think more about group work and how can I help students work together. So I would love it if you would try this. It's going to take a couple minutes, but this is well worth our time. I really think that you'll find something really positive out of looking at this. This is a tool used by Adobe for Teams. It's called My Creative Type. So if you wouldn't mind, could you click on that link and go through that? It's going to take about 2 or 3 minutes to go through it. And I think you'll find it really neat. If you could click on that, this is really good. Georgina's an orange monster. Okay, very good. Judgment free. And I'll pull up the window with it here. So this is Adobe's Creative Type. So just for timing's sake, even if you've done it before, go ahead and do it again. I've done it a couple times. I'm going to do it up here and go through this dichotomous tree of decisions. Let's see, like direction. You can skip the visuals if you want, but they're meant to reinforce your choice. Ah, the adventurer. Good. I'm almost done. I'm going through it for everybody's timing's sake. All right, what did I get? I'm a visionary. How about that? So go ahead and drop your creative type in the chat. And I am the visionary. I think it also has a social media post for you here where you can tweet it out if you wanted to post that on Twitter. Beth is the artist. Love it. Let me see if I can connect my Twitter on here. I love these instant things here. All right, everybody got my password, right? Good. Okay, I'll save it for you. All right, and then I'll add in here hashtag WanderlustEDU, just so we can all kind of see it. So if you look for the hashtag, you could see each other's if you wanted to post it there. Sweet. There we go. So the creative type is really interesting. And I want to talk to you about using this in the classroom with students. So if you look through this, you see there are all these different types. And Sherry's the producer. I love the muscle. You get it done, don't you, Sherry? Monique's a fellow visionary. Thank you. Look at all of our eyeballs on here. What I've done with my students is I tried something last fall. I plan to do it again. And I gave them a prototyping project, kind of an icebreaker, getting to know them. This is provided for face-to-face. If not, I'll figure something out. And I said, okay, I want you to design an intervention. Pick whoever you want to work with. So the students all picked who they wanted to work with. They were given a problem, a parameter, and then a target audience. And so it might be like how to help superheroes get to work fast, but it has to be solar powered. So they had to make something, right? So yes, Patsy, I believe it. You're a visionary. So with my students, I had them first get into groups, random groups, pick their best friends, whatever, and get some work done, try it out. Some came out with some great stuff. Then the next class period, I had them take this survey, this My Creative Type. So they did their creative type. And when they did their creative type, we then went back into our groups and I said, okay, now ask each other what your creative type is. And so I did this with 125 students. And I had 2 groups all day long that got nothing done. And guess what they had in common? They were all dreamers. Yeah, that's right, Sherry. They're all the same. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a dreamer in that case. Perhaps it was just the middle school, but they were all the same. And that told me about something to them. And I think it showed me something and helped me articulate something to them where it was kind of a happy accident because I didn't know how it was going to play out, but a teachable moment, not happy accident. It was basically saying to all of us that we have strengths. We need to play to our strengths, and playing to our strengths is really, really important because if we play to our strength and we play to somebody else's strength that's different, we can do some really, really amazing things. And as you would guess, the best prototypes and the most diverse prototypes and the ones that were actually finished, if I should say, had the most diverse group of creative types. And so I really like this test for students. Mine seems to change. I would mix them. Yes. In fact, if you look at, Sherry asked, would you mix and match groups? Knowing the types, definitely. If you take a look here, for a visionary like me, my ideal collaborator is a thinker. And if it said I was a thinker, it would say my ideal collaborator is somebody else. It's not necessarily a visionary. So you could use this to put together a team. You know, what I've done with students is basically say, get in a group, but your group has to be made up of people who have a different creative type. You can't have 2 of the same type in your group. So it's not perfect. I didn't get 6 different types. Some might be rare, some types, but this is a really good tool where you're breaking up students, not by boys group up, girls group up, students with the last name A or B group up. This is like powerful. We're using a real tool to help us work together. I absolutely love this tool, and it looks like based on the chat window, you're picking up what I'm laying down, right? So that's Adobe's creative type. Thank you, Sherry. Love it. Monique, perfect. All right, so let's take a look at a few more things here. I've done a little bit of work. No need to pull that slide up, I suppose. I've done a little bit of work with my students with what I call asynchronous and synchronous grouping. I just added this here in case you wanted to revisit it. This is a blog post I did last fall, and it was the second time I did some unique group work with my students. So think about a traditional classroom where your students, you want to do groups. So you might have somebody use their elbow partner right next to them. You might have these two desks and these two desks turn around and face each other and make a group of 4, and they produce something. I've done that with making mini movies, making presentations, collaborate on this. And it's very much a face-to-face synchronous project. But I've been really, really, as you can tell, thinking about the future of work. And there's been a lot of research that's saying the future of work is going to be what we call gig-based. Gig meaning different jobs, like a musician books different gigs, right? And if it's gig-based, you're going to find yourself working with different people, and often remote. And this research comes from well before COVID. Now we're seeing remote be this whole new thing where I think we're going to see a big shift in remote work. So what I did twice last year, once the year before with my students, is I broke them up into asynchronous groups. And let me explain the project just to make it more tangible. About a half mile from my school is an old cemetery. The folks buried in the cemetery date back to the American Revolution and things that we talk about in our history classes. And so every year I had walked my students, taken a mini field trip. We walked down the road and we've looked at the grave sites and we've created biographical sketches to try to tell the story of the history in our community. Cool project. It's always gone really well, but I try to iterate on it each year. So this year, what I did this past school year is I gave students jobs. Now I have 5 sections of students. In this case, I'm fortunate that it's the same topic. So my period 1 class is learning American history, and so is my period 9. It's all the same topic. So that does give me an advantage to break them up into this unique grouping style. So basically what I did with them is I decided to do it asynchronous. So instead of the 2 rows turning around and facing each other and making a group, there weren't any groups in each class. They were working with people that they never saw. So this is a little bit of how it worked. I have a picture here. So my first period class, for example, they were in charge of creating a timeline about one person buried in the cemetery. My period 3 group was required to create a biographical sketch. So I had like 23 different sites. And so students were given a project 1 through 23 in period 1. Period 3 was given the projects 1 through 23, right? Period 4, 1, 2, 23, but they were responsible for a different component of that person's life. A timeline, a biographical sketch, a slideshow, a movie. And then period 9, the last group, their job was to be the project manager. And so the project manager, they didn't do the research. Their job was to tag their classmates on work that needed to be done. So here you can see some of their conversations. You need to do this. Make sure you have your events. Make sure you do you cite your work. Make sure you use Hemingway app, one of my favorite tools for writing in the classroom. Share your slides with everybody, share your videos with everybody, and then let's get it into a website. And so this allowed students to have a different job and be the master of a job, which is much more in alignment with the gig-based economy. So my period 7 group, for example, they were the masters of making movies. And period 3 was writing a paragraph biographical sketch. Now, to be fair to the students, I would have wanted to do this multiple times so that each class period had the opportunity to be a project manager, to try to teach them about working in this asynchronous space, which I didn't even realize was coming when it came to remote learning and our pandemic quarantine. It's kind of a wild thing that happened with us, huh? Now, to help students in that, again, I'm a big fan of team sports. There's been a lot of research. I found the ones, as I shared with you, my ski school example, students who are best set up for that have already been working in teams. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead on this, but those that work in teams, and again, this relates to sports, athletics, confidence, and they have confidence and character. They manage change and failure. They pursue goals as a team. Those are attributes that researchers are finding through Gallup polls are characteristics of kids who play team sports as adults. This is what they turn into. Now, I'm going to skip that part because what I wanted to show was a video, but esports is, I think, this new form of accessible sports or athletics for students. This is a colleague of mine, Christine Lyon-Bailey. She's writing a book called the Esports Guidebook, coming out with Dave Burgess Press in the fall. It is one of our books from Ready Learner One as well. She talks about it as an opportunity to provide gaming students with a collaborative team environment that encourages communication, community, and celebration. Esports is really neat. I mean, this is students literally playing a video game, but they're collaborating, they're using critical thinking, and they're managing it together. It's a powerful tool. The latest reports are that esports is the athletics of quarantine. It's kind of a neat way to think about it, right? Really, really pretty wild. I wanted to share with you, kind of as I transition in this environment and then motivation. And I'll move through this here. So for environment, our learning environment is changing. I had done research in West Africa with an organization that wanted to deliver learning modules to people who didn't have electricity, but they had cell phone access. So they would charge their phones with solar power, and they would learn off their mobile device. So as an instructional designer, that was one of my projects that I did. And it was unbelievable to think of people around the world accessing content in a whole new way, and how it's becoming more and more accessible through things like smartphones. This study's 2 years old, but it shows you 2 years ago how many people have smartphones in all these places. And I think that number has increased. At the time of my research, where I was serving as an instructional designer on that mobile learning project, they were saying that there was one mobile device for every person on the planet in use. It doesn't mean every person had one. It just meant there were that many activated for every person on the planet. So there's a tool there, right? Accessible tech, learning in that space. I found with my students, a lot of them know their way around their phone, but it's very, very much at the top layer. They don't deep dive with how they use the phone and their smartphone. And I think that's what we can help them with as creators of content. All right. Virtual reality is one of these tools that's changing our environment. I have found using virtual tools with my students has led them to really drive up empathy. My favorite is the Anne Frank experience. The Anne Frank experience that brings students through the Anne Frank house. This is what they were doing here. It's a 20-minute experience. Even my physical education teacher here, seated in orange, came down and tried. It's just sobering and powerful and brings a sense of connectedness that my students hadn't previously had. Motivation is the last component in that human performance model. And, we talk about motivation as being intrinsic and then extrinsic. I talk about being a peak bagger. I used to be a peak bagger. I would climb peaks just to check them off so I could get all the ones done in my area. Versus a wanderluster where, we look around and we enjoy what we have and enjoy the process more than just the destination. And I think that intrinsic wanderluster mentality towards education is really what we want to help our students get to. We want to teach students to be the DIYers of the future. I can't tell you how many times my students have asked me to do something, and my way of figuring out how to help them is just to Google it. And I don't even mean it sarcastically. Like, you just Google it and then you figure it out. So helping them to learn how to do these tasks on their own and be self-starters is really important. But as we increase our digital reliance, for whatever reason, I have a feeling that we have to really start to focus on empathy. And I couldn't tell you why. It's a gut reaction that as you go more digital, less paper and pen and writing, as you go away from that, it seems like there's a tangibility of life that needs to be focused on. And it's a soft skill, empathy. And I believe, in my heart, that empathy is something that we need to start helping our students to learn to appreciate that the situation of others is not the same as theirs, and that people come from a different background and they have a different experience. Tools for VR, like I said, the Anne Frank house is my favorite one for that. I had my student Molly. Here's Molly in the Anne Frank experience. She's going through the secret annex, and she's about to discover that that bookshelf moves and it opens up to the secret living quarters where Anne Frank and her family visited. There goes the secret annex entrance. And so Molly walks into there in virtual reality and could feel differently. She expressed that this experience showed how cramped the rooms were and that she felt she was actually there. And she saw how Anne had to be very cautious because of the creaky floors. That's empathy at its finest. And so those are a little bit out there, getting into virtual reality. We're going to see more of that in our classrooms. And I would argue that, we want to move onward in education. And rather than really just worry about is something going to work, I would say, let's do this and drive forward. Embrace your inner Leroy Jenkins. Got to look up Leroy Jenkins. Education is changing because the world is changing. And I believe that if we boost up knowledge, skills, environment, motivation, we address them diligently, that we can lead ourselves and our students to success. And that, my friends, is what I had for you today. Did I make it on time? I did it. We made it. Yes. Murina, the video that you watched of this presentation is on Q's website. I think it's q.org/Microsoft. And Q is recording this, so you have access to it. Please feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk some more with me about it. I'd be happy to. Let me put that in the chat for you. The chat does get preserved, I believe, as well. I really enjoyed our time together. I hope you found it useful and productive in so many ways. I'm looking forward to other sessions. I'm doing another WanderlustEDU session on a different topic later this week that will focus on designing instruction with motivation in mind, so that motivational theory stuff. And so I have some tools and tricks about how I approach that, and we should approach that with kids. Thanks, everybody. See you later. Thanks, Christina. Thank you. Thanks, Monique. Thanks, Liz, Sherry. See ya. Bye, Georgina. Bye, Beth. Thank you. Thanks, Cheryl.